Thanks for joining us today at BIV Today, the daily business podcast from the newsroom of Business Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. This is the second part of our conversation with David McWIlliams. And David McWIlliams is an economist. He barely takes a breath in life without creating something. He's got a documentary, a column, a book, a podcast, whatever on the go. He's one of the world's most cited economists. His career took him through the Central Bank of Ireland, the UBS Bank, the Banque Nationale de Paris, and now he reproduces a couple of columns a week, produces 5 books, batch of documentaries, podcast, which is ranked in the top 6 in Ireland. The reason is that he works endlessly to help us understand economics. He's popularized them in a lot of ways with clear language and with not always taking them super seriously. He's the founder of Kilkenomics, a festival in Ireland that blends discussion with stand-up comedy. And he also leads the Global Irish Forum on the economy. He's going to be the featured speaker at the January 14th Chartered Financial Analysts Vancouver virtual conference. And so here's a bit of a tune-up of that conversation that you'll see. And he joins me today from Dublin. This is the second part of our conversation. We had a demand-side recession in 2008 and 9, and we have a real supply-side mess in the pandemic. Both were treated to a lot of government largesse. What worries you most about the government's effort at recovery?
I think it's an interesting question, Kirk, because obviously it's the one that I would grapple with a lot in Europe because we've done exactly the same, if not more. My own sense is that what we got was this extraordinary shock to the system. And the private sector did not just stop spending, but were ordered to stop spending, okay? Mm-hmm. So on our main streets, in our bars, our restaurants, yada, yada, all that sort of area, okay? And when you get something like that, what happens is people stop spending, and then they get nervous about the future. So they start saving dramatically, okay? So consequently, private people, the private sector, saved. In a situation like that, the government has to spend, otherwise demand will collapse completely. And I think that's what's happened. So I think what you will see is the cyclical impact of the opening up when that happens, okay? When the vaccines kick in and all that sort of stuff. It could be the first quarter, second, third, who knows now, right? Certainly in Europe, we've been knocked back, at least in our heads, I'd say half a year in terms of feeling, when are we going to open? But be that as it may, I think budget deficits will narrow much quicker than you think, because I think they're largely cyclical and they're driven by the pandemic. To the extent to which the market is worried about them, my own sense is that we're in a very different era. If you go back to, let's say, 1990, the ideology which existed from 1990 to, let's say, 2020, which is a 30-year period, which is broadly how long ideological movements tend to last, was like small government, and we worry about bond vigilantes, and we worry about overspending and taxes and yada, all that sort of stuff. That's all over now. It's all over. And I think we're into a period now of bigger governments, simply because the center has to deliver something for the people, larger deficits, and maybe the model for Canada, the United States, Western Europe is something that looks and smells like Japan. Because Japan in the last 30 years has been going through this demographically driven post-crash, post-balance sheet recession problem. And what they have done is they've simply recycled the savings of the country through their treasury market. I think we could be into something like that too. I don't see a big bang where America defaults like Argentina or like Brazil. It is still the number 1 country in the world, the most productive, it's got the best industries, et cetera, et cetera. So my sense is that we just have to begin to look at the world in a slow growth, higher debt, lower interest rate, lower return on investment, maybe even return of investment might end up being our watchword. And that, I think, is something that we just have to get our head around, that the America of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, this go, 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 we can have everything, we can have it now, we can consume more than we have, that may well turn back into something that looks and smells a bit more like Japan. And if you've been to Japan, Japan is not a bad place to be.
No, definitely not. Couple of last things before we
go for it, Kirk. We have time.
Okay. You were supportive initially in your country of the way banks were stabilizing the situation when the government essentially guaranteed what was on deposit. But then you criticized how long that guarantee remained.
Yes.
I want to get a sense from you whether you're able yet to see which measures might have to be protracted, almost become permanent out of the pandemic, and which ones ought not to be very long.
That's a good question. Well, I think if, for example, if we get something like 2008 in a microcosm, so let's say, for example, you take downtown Vancouver, which I suspect is a bit like Dublin or London, empty office blocks, expensive office blocks, heavily leveraged. People ain't going to go back to them, or if they do, the next rent review will be quite horrific for the owners, right? So take that as it may. It's quite obvious to me that there's going to be some significant defaults in commercial real estate all over the world. Not because they were particularly overvalued, but because people's lives have changed. We're doing this stuff, this Zoom stuff, instead of sitting face to face. To the extent that the banks are exposed to that, you can argue that this time around it was less commercial banks with savings on their balance sheet and maybe more private equity and hedge funds and all those crowd. But if we get a commercial property inspired banking crisis, there's no way in the world that the globe will react in the same way as it did in 2008. There's no appetite to bail out bankers, none at all. So that's the first thing. So I don't think that will happen. I think in terms of, and this is an interesting angle, the COVID payments that are being made in Canada, made in Ireland, made all over Europe, the idea that the government is giving you a check every month. This is basically the universal basic income dressed up as something else.
So is that going to happen now, do you think? We're going to really pilot, we're going to experiment with basic income?
I think this, because I think that, once you give permission for an idea, and once you start paying people checks, and once people realize, oh, okay, well, the deficit goes up, but rates aren't going up so much, and the market's not freaked out about it, then people say, well, maybe this should become permanent. Remember, income tax in the beginning was supposed to be temporary. It was, it was raised in the Napoleonic War. So.
But you're not worried about the boiling frog theory in this one. That one day, actually, the world really does wake up. It takes a look at the balance sheet and goes, oh, this is absurd. We have to, we're in crisis.
I think there will be moments where there will be default issues. There's no doubt of this. But I'm not in the camp that basically says the large Western countries are an Argentina or Mexico waiting to happen. The vast majority of us borrow in our own currency. This is the key. So the Canadian government doesn't issue dollarized debt and says, please, we want to be a better looking version of America, which is what the Mexicans had to do for many years, right? Okay, or we're a slightly less good looking version of America, but kiss us anyway, right? And God knows what you can do with us, okay? So Canada borrows money from Canada, from Canadians. And the Canadian Central Bank has this amazing thing called the ability to print money. So the Canadian Central Bank doesn't have a balance sheet like a commercial bank has, because there's a difference here between the user of money and the issuer of money. So you and I, Kirk, are users of money. Now, our kids might not think that, right?
No, we're issuers of money to them, as you know.
Right. So they think, down here in the basement, Dad has a little printing press that when we all want to go on holidays around Europe, that Dad will print it, right? But we understand that we've got to go to work for that. So we are users of money. The central bank is the issuer, and the Fed and the Bank of England, the ECB is the issuer of money, okay? So it faces no constraint as long as the rate of inflation remains low. And the question then is inflation around the corner? Have the markets got it completely wrong, and should Fed funds be at 10% now, right? My sense is no, because we didn't mention Asia. We didn't mention the fact that we're in a deflationary spiral at the moment. We have double-digit rates of unemployment. Our economies are operating well below the output gap, which is the rate of activity that would drive up the rate of inflation. If you go down to Silicon Valley, you have an extraordinary deflationary shock called technology. And at its basis, technological innovation always cuts prices. That's what it does. So my sense is that we are now in a new normal, which is quite different to the old normal. And one of the problems with central bankers and economic commentators and whatever is the majority of those in senior positions were educated and lived through the late 1970s, a period of high inflation when they were kids. And it's like everybody's experience. If your father went bust when you were a kid, there's a good chance you're going to be slightly more cautious with money than if your father has loads of money. Donald Trump's a great example. His dad didn't go bust. He's useless with money, right? Okay. So if you come through the 70s and early 80s as Europeans and Americans, imprinted on your worldview is a fear of inflation. And that begins to color your judgment about everything. But as you and I know, Kirk, we have lived through, in our adult life, extraordinary deflation.
Yeah.
And yet the collective...
And 23% interest rates.
Yeah, so that's all over.
Yeah.
That's all gone.
Have you figured out at all yet what the generation that's living through the pandemic might actually think in 10, 15 years?
Well, I look at what I really fear is that we're going to have a generation of kids who are going to be homeschooled by alcoholics. And that ain't going to help, because Irish drinking and American drinking's gone through the roof, and our kids are at home. So that's psychologically, we're in a really strange position. No, I haven't figured them out. I look at my own children.
A lot of complaints to school boards, I think, over there.
Yeah. There'll be a hell of a boom in sort of child psychology and adult psychiatry and psychology in a couple of years' time.
You're giving me investment tips, by the way. That's a good.
But you can have that for free. It's the
thank you.
Generation of homeschooled children homeschooled by alcoholics.
Yeah, that's great. That's a lovely dystopian view. I mean, as you alluded to earlier, I mean, Vancouver's population is about 1/3 of Asian descent, and it generates great debate here about the economic relationship we ought to have with China, and obviously whether that relationship collides with other places in Asia. I mean, Hong Kong, of course, part of China, but very much colliding there, and other parts of Asia. I mean, and for that matter, even America. So you're in a different part of the world. Help us understand, with your perspective, how you think we ought to be dealing with such a massive economy that has such limited transparency.
And becoming even more limited by the day, it seems.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to figure out. What I always remember being on the circuit in the last 10 years is that the best thing to be was a Chinese expert. And what really defined most Chinese experts was never having been to China at all. So I'd be very wary. I've been to China about 5 times. So, and I've always been very impressed and amazed by what's going on there. Shocked, terrified, but awestruck at the scale of everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite obvious that China has emerged out of this pandemic stronger than ever before, and its muscle flexing is a reflection of that.
Mm-hmm.
Its economy has recovered. Its economy has recovered quite significantly. Its dependency on trade, although still enormous, has been proven to be not that enormous. It's got its own domestic internal demand. I think if you go back to history, China begins to look and feel like Germany in the late 19th century, where it begins in 1850s, 1860s to start chipping away at British hegemony in Europe. And by 1900, it's a stronger country. And by 1914, they're at loggerheads, okay? You can go further back to Sparta and Athens, Rome and Carthage. These things happen. the one fact of life, and it was actually Plato who said this, and again, because the Greek empire was an empire of cities rather than a big centralized world, is that basically cities in the ascendancy are condemned to be dragged down and be pillaged by cities coming behind them. And I think it's the same for countries. So I would think that we are in the Chinese century. Canada has played a very clever game, I think. I worked as a bartender in Toronto many, many years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And in a place called Ontario Place, which was a odd park. You know the park in Toronto?
I probably went there.
My coworker.
I might have bought a drink from you. I may have bought a drink from you. Yeah.
I bet you did. I was a bartender there. The Irish students used to go to Canada and America to work in the 80s.
They still they still come here every summer.
Yeah. And I hope we're behaving well, or better than we did back then. But I have always thought the Canadian policy towards Asia has been very, very clever, because we know from all the data that immigrant populations are much more entrepreneurial, much more likely to create a job than take a job. Okay, much more likely. Canada has absorbed in and made welcome many extraordinary individuals from Asia who will go on to do extraordinary things in Canada. And I think the idea that the way in which to deal with China is to put up barriers to it seems to me to be illogical. I think you just got to get used to it, that the great world spins, and it spins in directions that sometimes you can't forecast.
So dissuading foreign buyers from getting into the housing market, that idea.
Well, I suppose that's an insurance policy if you're Chinese. They're not buying, I'd like to break it to you, they're not buying apartments in Vancouver because they love you. They're buying apartments in Vancouver as an insurance policy.
Yeah.
I think
it's a safety deposit box, right?
It's a safety deposit box, right? Canada's always behaved very well with respect to people's capital, and they know that. They also have very, very deep networks now. I mean, I'm talking about in the mid '80s when I was a bartender in Toronto. That's going on 2 generations. It's certainly a generation ago. So these links are very, very deep. I would worry about Canadian property prices. I think that there comes a moment where the value of an asset and the price of an asset have to have some relationship to each other. And I think Canadian property prices, may be driven by cash from Asia, have become incredibly frothy. But I'm sure you guys are well aware of that.
Yeah. No, we talk about it all the time.
Yeah. And but again, to come back to the question about Asia and China in particular, I think Canada has probably done as well and figured out as beneficial to Canadians a policy. You live in the Pacific. You don't live in the Atlantic. You might look like us, okay? But that's because you were stuck over there by colonialization. Do you know what I mean? Like, you live in that part of the world. Vancouver, although, if you think about how the British in British Columbia had Victoria Island, or wasn't that beside you? And, Vancouver was pretending to be a little bit of Kent in the Pacific. But you're in their neighborhood.
Well, we were located here because of our shipping lane abroad, right? Like we weren't located here because we're an hour away from a nice ski hill, right? It's
and of course the British did it because the Americans beat the Mexicans in the war and they took over California, and suddenly the British said, Jesus, we can't let the Americans run the Pacific.
No.
So I mean, all these are no accidents. But my point is that in the same way as Ireland looks out on the Atlantic, we are an Atlantic people. That is our world, okay? And the closest place to us when we look west is Newfoundland. And they talk like us and they look like us, right? Okay. Vancouver is a Pacific city with Pacific sensibilities. And it's close to Asia. So it's not surprising, I think, that you have a large Asian population.
Yeah. Look, I can't let you go as the founder of a conference on stand-up comedy without hearing one of your top 10 jokes on
I can't do that. I can't do that.
economists or business or even journalism.
No, the thing
Come
is
on,
that
David.
I am. No,
Take a deep
is
breath.
what we really do is we always say to the economists, right? Your job is not to be funny on stage. The comedians, they're really, really funny. We have an expression in Ireland, they've got funny bones. When someone's got funny bones, they're actually deeply funny. So I will avoid that thing and just say that the reason we bring the comedians on stage at Kilkenomics with the economists is to give the economists the permission to be human. And once you do that, strange things happen.
Yeah. Well, did you put the conference online this year? Is it virtual?
No. We couldn't be bothered. I mean, these are live events. They take place in bars and theaters, old deconsecrated churches and, restaurants and everything. If conferences were supposed to be, or festivals were supposed to be done on Zoom, there'd be no festivals. Festivals are deeply human social events where people come and they drink and they chat and they flirt and all the good stuff, right? So what we decided when the pandemic happened, I do another literary festival as well, but we decided that we run festivals. We don't do online learning. And when the pandemic disappears, when we're all vaccinated up the yin yang, then the festivals will come back.
Well, that was my last question to you, and it's I mean, economics is all about the human psyche, isn't it? I mean, so when does the psyche repair sufficiently so that we congregate again and we behave the way that we've behaved over centuries in terms of thinking about growth and changes and things like that, and do it in a way that's face to face. What has to happen, do you think, for the psyche to repair?
I think the vaccine has to be rolled out and it has to work. And I think that once, for example, my mom's generation and those at risk in our country and in Canada are vaccinated, then people will chill out about it. People will become much, much less. If the vaccination works, what you're going to find is the ratio between COVID cases and deaths collapses. So you have COVID cases, but no deaths. And once you have no deaths, then the threat is gone. So I would think actually what will happen is that the psyche will change quicker than people imagine. And I believe that it could be March, it could be April, it could be May, but whenever that cohort of at-risk people are protected, then COVID becomes a pain, but not a killer of the elderly, the infirm, the high risk. And then our behavior changes dramatically. And by Jesus, I think people are going to party their heads off. I think this is going to be like, the party to top all parties. And it's going to go on for weeks and weeks. And all those pent up savings that we talked about at the start are going to be spent. And it's going to be a hoot.
Well, I really hope you're right. We can lock up our basements again, right? And
exactly.
Never go back.
Look, this is where I am. I've been stuck down here underground for months.
Yeah. Well, look, get out of there. Get out of there as soon as you can, David.
Kirk, listen,
a real treat to meet and talk. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your time today.
Not at all. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Yeah. I'm Kirk LaPointe, BIV publisher and editor in chief. Thanks for watching BIV Today.